The elevator doors of Sterling Plaza had barely closed on Daniel Reyes when the old man collapsed against the marble wall of the lobby behind him, and the sound of a body hitting stone cracked louder than it should have across the cavernous atrium. Daniel spun back through the closing doors on instinct, his daughter's small hand slipping from his as she darted toward the commotion before he could stop her. Two security guards were already converging, one of them speaking into his radio with the clipped urgency of a man who had decided in the space of 3 seconds that the collapsed stranger was a threat rather than a patient. Daniel caught the words, "Unidentified male, possible trespasser," and felt something cold settle in his chest, because the old man on the floor was gripping his cane like a lifeline and staring up at the guards with the confused, wounded dignity of someone who had once commanded rooms far larger than this one. His daughter Mia was already crouched beside him, her small palm pressed to his weathered hand, and when the taller guard reached down to haul the man up by the arm, Daniel heard himself say the words before he had decided to say them at all. "Don't touch him. That's my father-in-law." The lie left his mouth clean and whole, no stammer, no hesitation, as though some other version of himself had been waiting years for the excuse to say it. The guard froze, with his hand still hovering near the old man's elbow, and every eye in the small circle that had gathered turned toward Daniel, then toward the woman standing 3 feet away who had until that exact moment been a complete stranger reading a folder of documents near the elevator bank. Daniel felt his pulse hammering as he closed the distance between them and did the only thing his scrambled mind could think to do. He reached for her hand. In that same breath, he registered distantly that he had walked into Sterling Plaza that morning only to beg a mid-level loan officer for a 90-day extension on a business line of credit, and that he was now somehow standing in the middle of a stranger's crisis instead of his own. His heart pounding for reasons that had nothing to do with unpaid invoices. Elena Voss did not pull away, though every muscle in her body screamed to. She had spent 11 days trailing Charles Whitmore through this building, cataloging his movements, his medications, the names of the men who visited his penthouse office at odd hours. And she had never once planned for the possibility that he would collapse in a public lobby before she had gathered enough to move against the people circling him like vultures. When the guard's eyes flicked to her, demanding confirmation with nothing more than a raised eyebrow, she made a decision that would unravel 11 days of careful, invisible work in a single sentence. "Yes," she said, and her voice came out steadier than she felt. "He's my father. He has a heart condition, and he wandered off from his nurse this morning. Please, just let us get him to a chair." The lie tasted strange in her mouth, foreign and dangerous. But underneath the danger was something else, a flicker of relief that someone else had stepped between Charles Whitmore and the men who wanted him gone before he could change his will. She had seen 2 of those men only an hour earlier, riding the elevator up to the 14th floor, with the particular stiffness of people who had rehearsed their smiles. The guards exchanged a look loaded with the particular reluctance of men who did not want a lawsuit on their hands, and the taller one finally stepped back, muttering something about calling the building's medical staff instead of the police. Daniel dropped to one knee beside the old man, keeping his voice low and even the way he had learned to when Mia woke from nightmares and asked if he was hurt anywhere specific. Charles Whitmore's eyes, sharp despite the tremor in his hands, moved from Daniel's face to Elena's, and lingered there far longer than a disoriented old man's gaze should have. He did not look confused. He looked like a man doing arithmetic. His attention caught on the thin gold chain of Elena's throat, the one with the small tarnished locket she never took off, and something crossed his face that might have been recognition or might have been grief. And then it was gone, tucked back behind the mask of an elderly man too shaken to speak clearly. "My chest," Charles finally murmured, pressing a hand there, though his eyes never left Elena's locket. "It happens sometimes. I forget where I am." Mia, still crouched at his side with the fearless curiosity of a 7-year-old, reached out and touched the locket herself before Elena could think to stop her, and asked in the clear, carrying voice children use without any sense of consequence whether it opened. Elena's fingers closed instinctively over her daughter's small hand, gentle but firm, and she said only that it was very old and very fragile, and that she would show her another time. Charles watched this exchange with an intensity that unsettled Daniel more than the man's collapse had, though Daniel had no context yet for why an old man's eyes on a piece of jewelry should feel like the floor tilting slightly beneath his feet. A small crowd of office workers had gathered near the revolving doors, phones half raised, and Daniel found himself grateful, for the first time in his life, that people filmed tragedy more readily than they intervened in it. The building's on-call physician arrived within minutes. A brisk woman who checked Charles's pulse and pupils and declared with visible relief that he was stable enough to avoid an ambulance, but should not be left alone. She turned to Daniel and Elena as though the matter were already settled, asking which of them would be taking him home. And Daniel felt the lie tightening around his throat like a collar he had fastened himself. He looked at Elena silently, pleading for some kind of exit, and found instead that she was already answering, telling the physician that she would take her father back to her apartment for the night and have her husband bring the car around. The word husband detonated quietly between them, unspoken but unmistakable, and Daniel understood in that moment that whatever this was, it had already grown too large to walk back from in front of witnesses. The physician nodded, satisfied, and moved on to write something in a small leather notebook, leaving the three of them standing in the wreckage of a story none of them had agreed to tell together. They ended up in the parking garage 20 minutes later, the three adults and one increasingly fascinated child standing beside Daniel's battered sedan, while Charles Whitmore leaned heavily on his cane and studied Daniel with an attention that felt less like gratitude and more like evaluation. Daniel finally found the nerve to ask the question that had been building in his chest since the lobby, keeping his voice low, so Mia, now buckled into the back seat and humming to herself, wouldn't hear. He asked Elena point blank why she had gone along with it. Why a stranger would claim a man she'd never met as her father in front of security and a doctor without blinking. Elena met his eyes for a long moment before answering, and when she spoke, she chose her words with the precision of someone rehearsing a truth just enough to make it a lie. She told him that Charles was an old family friend of her late mother's, that she had recognized him the moment he started to fall, and that she couldn't bear the thought of him being dragged out by security and humiliated in front of a crowd of strangers who had no idea who he was. It wasn't a complete lie, and that was somehow worse, because Daniel found himself believing every word of it. He studied her face in the flat fluorescent light of the garage, the careful composure that didn't quite reach her eyes, and told himself that whatever she wasn't saying was none of his business, that he had bigger problems than a stranger's secrets. His construction supply company was 6 weeks from missing payroll. His ex-wife's lawyer had sent another letter about custody arrangements that morning, and the last thing he needed was to become entangled with whatever quiet storm was clearly following Elena Voss. He almost said as much out loud, almost thanked her for her help, and excused himself to load Mia into the car and drive away from this entire strange afternoon, when Charles Whitmore spoke for the first time since the lobby. His voice suddenly clearer, steadier, almost amused, in a way that made the hair on Daniel's arms rise. "You two make a convincing couple," the old man said, looking between them with something unreadable flickering behind his tired eyes. "Convincing enough that I'd like to have dinner with my daughter and her husband tomorrow night. Say 7 o'clock at my house." The silence that followed stretched long enough for Mia to stick her head out the car window and ask if they were leaving yet. And in that silence, Daniel watched something shift across Elena's face. A flash of panic, so quickly buried, he might have imagined it if he hadn't been staring directly at her. She recovered fast, telling Charles that of course they would come, that she'd been meaning to visit anyway, and Daniel heard himself agreeing before he'd fully processed what he was agreeing to. Some instinct in him recognizing that refusing now would unravel the fragile fiction faster than accepting it ever could. As Charles allowed himself to be helped into the back of a car his driver had finally located, he glanced once more at the locket at Elena's throat. And this time he didn't hide the reaction fast enough. His hand trembled against the car door, not from illness, and he said quietly, almost to himself, that he hadn't seen a chain like that in over 20 years. Elena's face went pale beneath the parking garage lights, and Daniel, watching her carefully for the first time since this had all begun, understood that whatever he had just stumbled into had roots far deeper than a single lie told to protect a stranger from security guards. Charles's driver shut the door with a soft, final click, and the car pulled away down the ramp, leaving the two of them standing alone under the flickering garage lights, with Mia's small voice drifting out the window, asking who the nice old man was and whether he was going to be their new grandpa. Elena did not answer the child's question, and Daniel found he couldn't either. Instead, before she turned to leave, she pressed a business card into his hand, nothing on it but a phone number written in blue ink and no name at all, and told him only that she would call him before tomorrow evening to work out what they needed to say. He watched her walk away across the concrete, her heels echoing off the pillars, and felt the strange, unfamiliar sensation of having agreed to something enormous without ever hearing its terms. That night, after Mia had fallen asleep clutching the stuffed rabbit she refused to travel without, Daniel sat at his kitchen table, staring at the card, turning it over twice, weighing the exhaustion in his bones against the strange, insistent pull of unfinished questions. He thought about payroll, about his daughter's small hand slipping so easily into a stranger's, about the particular way Elena had said the word husband, like she was testing whether it would hold weight, and about an old man's trembling hand against a car door over a piece of jewelry that shouldn't have meant anything to anyone. He didn't sleep well that night, and somewhere in the tangled hours before dawn, he decided that whatever waited for him at 7 o'clock the next evening, he would walk into it with his eyes open, because a man who had already told one impossible lie for a stranger had very little left to lose by seeing where the second one led. Elena called at 7 the next morning, exactly as she'd promised, and the sound of her voice through the phone was so composed that Daniel almost forgot the panic he'd seen flicker across her face in the parking garage the night before. She didn't waste time on pleasantries. She told him they needed to meet before dinner, somewhere quiet, to align their story before Charles Whitmore had the chance to ask questions neither of them were prepared to answer. Daniel agreed. Before he'd finished his coffee, dropped Mia at his sister's apartment with a vague explanation about a work obligation, and drove to the small diner Elena had named on the edge of downtown, the kind of place with cracked vinyl booths and a waitress who called everyone honey without looking up from her notepad. He sat in the parking lot for a full minute before going in, staring at his own reflection in the rearview mirror, wondering when exactly his life had turned into something he could no longer explain to his own sister without sounding unhinged. Elena was already seated when he arrived, a folder closed in front of her, her hands wrapped around a coffee cup she hadn't touched. She looked different in daylight, less like the composed stranger from the lobby and more like a woman who hadn't slept much either. Faint shadows under her eyes that no amount of careful makeup had fully hidden. Daniel slid into the booth across from her and waited, because something in the set of her shoulders told him she needed a moment before she spoke, and he had learned from years of watching his ex-wife brace herself before difficult conversations to recognize the particular stillness of someone gathering courage. When Elena finally looked up, she didn't apologize, and she didn't explain herself the way he'd expected. Instead, she asked him a question that reordered everything he thought he understood about the day before. "How much trouble is your company in?" she asked, her eyes steady on his. And Daniel felt his stomach drop because he hadn't told her anything about Sterling Plaza, or the loan officer, or the 6 weeks of runway left before he had to lay off men who had worked for his father before him. He asked her how she knew, and she admitted without any visible shame that she'd looked into him overnight, the same way she looked into everyone who mattered to her current situation. She told him plainly that she worked as an independent financial consultant, that she had resources most people didn't, and that she was prepared to offer him something concrete in exchange for a favor that would cost him very little beyond his time and his silence. She wanted him to keep playing the role of her husband for the next several weeks, however long it took her to finish what she'd started with Charles Whitmore, and in return, she would personally guarantee the capital his business needed to survive the quarter. Daniel sat with that for a long moment, turning his coffee cup in slow circles on the table, and told her honestly that it sounded like exactly the kind of deal his father used to warn him about. The kind where the money arrives clean and the debt arrives later, dressed up as something else. His father had built the company from nothing, one truckload of lumber at a time, and had drilled into Daniel from childhood that the fastest way to lose everything was to accept help from someone whose real motives you hadn't bothered to understand. Elena didn't flinch at his suspicion. She seemed almost relieved by it, as though a man too eager to accept her offer would have worried her more than one who pushed back. She told him she understood if he wanted to walk away, that she had no right to ask a stranger to entangle his daughter in whatever this became, but that the offer was real, and it would remain real whether or not he decided to trust her. Daniel studied her face, the careful blankness of it, and asked the question that had kept him up half the night. He asked who Charles Whitmore actually was to her, and whether the man on the garage floor last night, trembling over a piece of jewelry, had any real claim to the word father he'd used to describe himself. Elena's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, and for the first time since he'd met her, Daniel watched her choose silence over a lie. She told him only that Charles Whitmore had known her mother a very long time ago, that there was history there too complicated to explain over diner coffee, and that she needed time near him to understand things about her own family that no one had ever been willing to tell her directly. It wasn't the whole truth. Daniel could tell that much from the careful architecture of her sentences. But it also wasn't nothing, and something about the rawness beneath her composure made him believe that whatever she was chasing mattered to her in a way that went beyond money or convenience. He thought of his own mother, gone 8 years now, and the boxes of her letters he still hadn't opened, because some truths felt too heavy to hold before you were ready. And he found, against his better judgment, that he understood Elena's evasions more than he wanted to. He asked her more gently this time whether whatever she was looking for was worth the risk she seemed to be taking, and for a moment something flickered across her face that looked almost like exhaustion, the kind that came from carrying a weight alone for far too long. She admitted quietly that she didn't know anymore, that some mornings she woke up certain she was doing the right thing, and other mornings she wondered if she'd simply built an elaborate excuse to chase a ghost. It was the most honest thing she'd said to him since they'd met, and Daniel found himself oddly grateful for it, even though it answered none of his real questions. They spent the next hour building the scaffolding of a marriage that had never existed. Inventing a courthouse wedding 2 years prior, a modest reception at a restaurant that had since closed, a story about how they'd met through a mutual friend from Daniel's old construction crew. Elena took notes in small, precise handwriting, cross-referencing details against Daniel's actual life so their fiction would hold up against casual questions, asking about Mia's school, his sister's name, the exact address of the house he'd grown up in, so nothing would trip them up if Charles asked something specific. She asked about small human details too, the kind a real wife would know, like whether Daniel preferred his coffee black or how he took his eggs, and jotted the answers down beside the more practical facts, as though she understood that a convincing lie lived in the tiny details rather than the large ones. Daniel found himself unsettled by how easily she absorbed the details of his life, filing them away with the efficiency of someone accustomed to memorizing information under pressure. And he wondered, not for the first time, what kind of work actually produced a person like this. When they finally left the diner, Elena paused at her car and turned back to him with something almost like hesitation, an expression that looked out of place on her otherwise controlled face. She told him that Mia shouldn't come to dinner that evening, that whatever happened at Charles Whitmore's house needed to happen without a child in the room, at least until Elena understood what kind of danger, if any, actually surrounded the old man. Daniel bristled at the word danger, asked her directly what exactly he was walking his daughter's temporary family fiction into. And Elena's answer was careful, in a way that told him she was choosing exactly how much fear to give him, and no more. She told him there were people who wanted Charles Whitmore's signature on documents he hadn't fully read, people who had been circling him for months, and that her presence near him was the only thing currently standing between his estate and a decision he might regret. She didn't tell him who those people were, and Daniel didn't push, though he filed the omission away carefully the way he'd learned to file away every unanswered question from his ex-wife's slow unraveling before their divorce, understanding that some truths only revealed themselves when the person holding them ran out of room to keep hiding. Before she drove off, she added one more thing, almost as an afterthought, telling him that whatever he saw or heard that evening, he should let her lead. That Charles Whitmore was sharper than his fragile appearance suggested, and would notice the smallest inconsistency faster than either of them could afford. Daniel watched her taillights disappear around the corner and sat in his own car for a long moment afterward, wondering whether he'd just agreed to help a woman right some old buried wrong, or whether he'd simply agreed to walk further into a fire he didn't yet understand the shape of. That evening, Daniel arrived at Charles Whitmore's house, alone in the sense that mattered. Mia safely deposited with his sister for the second time that week, though Elena was waiting for him at the end of the long gravel driveway when he pulled up, dressed in something simple and dark that made her look like she belonged in the house rather than someone infiltrating it. The house itself was smaller than Daniel expected, from a man who'd apparently once had enough power to attract circling vultures. An elegant colonial set back from the road with ivy climbing one side and lights glowing warm behind curtained windows, more like a home than the fortress he'd imagined. Elena reached for his hand before they reached the door, and the gesture felt less like performance and more like bracing. Two people steadying each other before stepping into water neither of them could see the bottom of. Charles Whitmore opened the door himself, looking sturdier than he had the day before, dressed in a cardigan that made him look like anyone's grandfather rather than the man whose trembling hand had unsettled Daniel so deeply in the parking garage. He welcomed them warmly, almost too warmly, ushering them into a dining room set for three with the kind of care that suggested he'd spent the whole day preparing for this dinner rather than resting after a medical scare. Over a meal of roasted chicken and vegetables that Charles admitted with a self-deprecating laugh his housekeeper had actually prepared. The conversation moved through safe, shallow waters. Questions about Daniel's business, about Mia's age and school, about how the young couple had supposedly met. Daniel answered as rehearsed, watching Elena from the corner of his eye as she wove her fabricated history into the conversation with unsettling ease, and he found himself almost admiring the skill of it, even as it unnerved him. It was over dessert that Charles set down his spoon, folded his hands, and looked directly at Elena with an expression that shed every ounce of the harmless grandfather charm he'd worn all evening. He told her quietly that he had known her mother Anna a very long time ago, and that the resemblance between them had struck him the moment she'd caught him in the lobby, close enough that his heart had nearly given out from more than just his condition. Elena's hand went still around her water glass, and Daniel watched the color drain slightly from her face as Charles continued saying that Anna had disappeared from his life over 2 decades ago, under circumstances he had never fully understood, and that he had spent years afterward wondering what had happened to the daughter she'd been carrying when she left. The locket, he said, turning to look at the one still resting against Elena's collarbone, had belonged to Anna, a gift he'd given her himself before everything between them had gone wrong. The silence that followed was thick enough that Daniel could hear the grandfather clock ticking somewhere in the hallway, and he watched Elena's carefully constructed composure crack for the first time since he'd met her, her eyes glistening with something she seemed determined not to let fall. She told Charles in a voice stripped of its usual precision that her mother had died 6 years ago without ever telling her who her father was, that Anna had raised her alone in a small apartment 2 states away, working double shifts at a diner, not unlike the one where Elena had met Daniel that morning, and that she had spent months since her mother's death trying to piece together fragments of a past Anna had guarded fiercely until the end. Charles's hands trembled again, though this time Daniel understood it had nothing to do with his heart condition, and the old man reached across the table, not toward Elena's hand, but toward the locket itself, asking softly if he might see inside it, something he said he hadn't been permitted to do in over 20 years. Elena unclasped the chain with fingers that weren't quite steady and placed it in his palm. And when Charles opened the small tarnished locket, his breath caught audibly. Inside was a faded photograph cut down to fit the tiny frame of a young woman laughing at someone just out of frame, and beside it, barely visible, the edge of a second photograph tucked behind the first. Charles worked it free with the careful patience of a man handling something sacred, and revealed underneath it a photograph of himself decades younger, arms slung around the same laughing woman, both of them impossibly young against a backdrop of a city skyline. He set the locket down on the white tablecloth as though it had grown too heavy to hold, and looked up at Elena with an expression that mixed grief and disbelief and something that looked almost like hope, and said in a voice barely above a whisper that he needed a blood test. Not because he doubted her, but because if she was who he now believed her to be, there were people in his life who would need indisputable proof before they would ever accept the truth peacefully. Daniel, watching this unfold from across a table meant to host a fictional marriage, understood with sudden, sinking clarity that the lie he'd told to protect a falling stranger had led him directly into the middle of a family secret 20 years in the making. One that had nothing to do with him and everything to do with the woman whose hand he was currently instinctively holding beneath the table. Charles studied the two of them for a long moment, the trembling in his hands finally settling, and said almost to himself that fate had a strange way of returning what had been taken, and that he intended, blood test or not, to make certain no one took it from him again. The blood test results arrived 9 days later, delivered not by mail, but by Charles Whitmore himself, who showed up unannounced at Daniel's small house on a Saturday morning, holding a sealed envelope with the kind of grip that suggested he'd been carrying it around all day, unable to decide when to open it. Mia answered the door before Daniel could stop her, delighted by the sight of the old man she had already decided was her new grandfather, and dragged him by the hand into the kitchen, where she was in the middle of decorating cupcakes with a haphazard enthusiasm that left blue frosting on nearly every surface within reach. Charles laughed for the first time Daniel had heard a real laugh unguarded, and allowed himself to be seated at the small table while Mia explained with great seriousness that sprinkles had to go on before the frosting set or they wouldn't stick properly. Daniel watched from the doorway, struck by how naturally his daughter had folded this stranger into her world, and felt a fresh wave of guilt for the lie that had made this possible in the first place. In the 9 days since dinner at Charles's house, the old man had called twice just to check on Mia, had sent over a small toy he'd apparently spotted in a shop window, and Daniel had found himself unable to muster the will to discourage the growing bond, even knowing how complicated its foundation truly was. Elena arrived 20 minutes later, having been summoned by the same phone call that brought Daniel out of his Saturday routine. And the moment she stepped through the door, Charles set the envelope on the table between the cupcake wrappers and looked at her with an expression that held no more room for waiting. He told her he hadn't opened it yet, that he'd wanted to do it in front of her, and Elena's hand found the edge of the table as though she needed something solid to hold on to. Daniel ushered Mia into the living room with the excuse of finding a movie to watch, though he suspected she understood in the intuitive way children sometimes did that something important was happening in the kitchen that didn't include her, and she went without complaint, taking one cupcake with her as a form of quiet negotiation. He lingered in the doorway a moment longer than necessary before joining Mia, unable to tear himself entirely away from what he sensed was about to become a defining moment in a story he'd been dragged into against his will, but could no longer imagine walking away from. Charles opened the envelope with hands that had gone steady in a way Daniel hadn't seen from him yet, as though the old man had decided whatever the result said, he would face them without flinching. He read the single page inside twice, his lips moving slightly around words he didn't say aloud, and then he looked up at Elena with tears standing openly in his eyes, the kind of unashamed emotion that men of his generation rarely allowed themselves in front of others. He told her the results confirmed what he'd known the moment he'd seen the locket, that she was his granddaughter Anna's daughter, and that whatever had driven her mother away from him 23 years ago, it hadn't been enough to erase the resemblance that had stopped his heart cold in that lobby. Elena's composure, the careful architecture she'd maintained through every conversation Daniel had witnessed, finally gave way entirely, and she pressed both hands over her mouth, as though trying to hold something in that had been building for far longer than 9 days. It took several minutes before either of them could speak clearly, and when Elena finally did, her voice came out rougher than Daniel had ever heard it, stripped of the calculation that usually shaped her words. She told Charles that her mother had never once mentioned his name, that Anna had raised her with a story about a father who died before Elena was born, a story Elena had believed without question until she found a box of old letters after her mother's funeral, letters that hinted at a different, more complicated truth that Anna had never lived long enough to explain. She described haltingly the years of asking her mother gentle questions about her father, only to be met with a closed, pained expression that eventually taught Elena to stop asking, to accept the silence as its own kind of answer, one she had carried without understanding until the letters surfaced and rewrote everything she thought she knew. Charles absorbed this with visible pain, admitting that he'd searched for Anna for years after she disappeared, hiring investigators who found nothing, eventually convincing himself she had wanted to be found and simply hadn't wanted him. A belief, he said, had cost him more sleep over the decades than any business failure ever had. Daniel, standing at the edge of the kitchen with a dish towel still in his hands, felt like an intruder on a grief 2 decades in the making. And yet neither Charles nor Elena asked him to leave, as though his presence had already become woven into whatever strange new family was assembling itself in his kitchen. He found himself thinking unexpectedly of his own daughter in the next room, of how much of her life would someday be shaped by absences and half-truths he hoped he'd never have to explain. And the thought made him step forward instinctively, pulling out the third chair at the table and sitting down without quite deciding to, as though his body understood before his mind did that he belonged in this conversation now. However he'd arrived at it, the tender moment didn't last as long as it deserved to. Charles's phone rang before either of them could ask the deeper questions clearly forming behind their eyes, and his face changed the moment he saw the caller's name on the screen, tightening into the wary expression Daniel now recognized as the mask Charles wore whenever the outside world intruded on his private life. He excused himself to take the call in the next room, and when he returned several minutes later, the warmth had drained from his face, entirely replaced by something closer to fear than Daniel had seen from him even during the collapse in the lobby. He told them without preamble that the call had come from his lawyer, informing him that his nephew Victor, who currently ran daily operations at Whitmore Holdings, had somehow already heard rumors of a woman claiming to be Charles's granddaughter and was moving to have Charles evaluated for mental competency before any new claim could be recognized in his will. Elena's face went carefully blank in a way Daniel had come to recognize as her retreating behind old defenses, and she asked Charles in a voice gone flat and controlled again exactly how much power Victor held over the company and over Charles's own affairs. Charles explained with the weary precision of a man reciting a wound he'd nursed for years that Victor had run Whitmore Holdings for the better part of a decade, while Charles had gradually withdrawn from daily involvement after his wife's death, and that Victor had built enough loyalty among the board and enough documented concern about Charles's recent health episodes to make a competency challenge dangerously plausible. He admitted that Victor had never been cruel, exactly, had in fact worked himself half to death expanding the company while Charles grieved, but that somewhere along the way, Victor's dedication had curdled into something closer to entitlement. A quiet, corrosive belief that the company was more rightfully his than anyone else's earned through years. Anna had spent absent, and Charles had spent grieving. Daniel listened to this unfold with a growing unease that had nothing to do with the fiction he was maintaining, and everything to do with the realization that he had walked his daughter's life into the orbit of real corporate danger. The kind of consequence that didn't resolve itself with an apology or a returned favor. He asked more sharply than he intended what exactly Victor stood to gain by having Charles declared incompetent, and Charles answered honestly that it would allow Victor to consolidate control of the company's remaining shares under a family trust structure that named Victor as sole trustee, effectively erasing any possibility of Elena inheriting anything, even if her parentage was legally established. It wasn't simple greed, Charles added quietly, watching Elena's face as he said it, because Victor genuinely believed he had earned this, had sacrificed a marriage and his health and his youth to the company, while Anna walked away from all of it. And in Victor's mind, rewarding a stranger's daughter with any part of that inheritance would be a fundamental injustice, rather than simple family loyalty. Elena absorbed this with the stillness of someone recalculating an entire strategy in real time. And when she finally spoke, she told Charles that she needed access to the company's recent financial filings, specifically anything related to decisions made in the 18 months since his wife's death. When Charles admitted he'd been least attentive to the details of daily operations. Charles hesitated, clearly torn between trust in his newly discovered granddaughter and the ingrained caution of a man who had been burned badly enough by loss to guard what remained of his life carefully, but eventually agreed, telling her he would have his assistant compile whatever she needed by the following week. He added, almost as an afterthought, that he intended to introduce Elena publicly as his granddaughter at the company's upcoming quarterly gathering, a decision that visibly startled her. And when she asked whether that was wise given Victor's maneuvering, Charles said simply that hiding would only make Victor's competency claims more convincing, and that the only way to protect what remained of his family was to stand in the light rather than the shadows. Daniel watched this exchange and understood with a clarity that unsettled him that Elena's request wasn't born purely from a granddaughter's love or curiosity. There was calculation beneath it. the same careful, investigative precision she'd shown from the very beginning. And he found himself wondering, not for the first time, whether her presence in Charles's life was motivated as much by justice as by genuine affection, or whether those two things had simply become impossible for her to separate. He thought about raising the question aloud, but something in the exhaustion etched across her face stopped him. A recognition that whatever answer she might give wouldn't be entirely honest. Not because she meant to deceive him, but because she likely didn't fully know the answer herself. After Charles left that afternoon, promising to send a car for them both the following weekend for a longer visit, Daniel found Elena still sitting at his kitchen table, staring at nothing in particular. The cupcake wrappers still scattered around her like evidence of a normal Saturday morning that had briefly, impossibly, existed. He sat down across from her and asked gently whether she was doing what she was doing because she loved the idea of having a grandfather, or because she was chasing something else entirely. Something that had started long before Charles ever collapsed in that lobby. Elena was quiet for a long moment, turning her coffee cup the way she had at the diner days before, and then she admitted, in a voice smaller than he'd heard from her, that her mother hadn't just left Charles behind. She told him that Anna had died of a heart condition, strikingly similar to the one Charles had just displayed in the lobby, a condition the doctors had told Elena was hereditary, and that in the last months of her life, Anna had grown increasingly paranoid, insisting to Elena that someone had been trying to push her out of a life she'd once had, though she'd never explained clearly who or why. Daniel felt something cold settle in his stomach, as Elena continued telling him that after her mother's death, she'd found financial records suggesting Anna had once held a substantial trust fund that had mysteriously emptied years before her disappearance from Charles's life, and that the timeline of that emptying lined up almost exactly with Victor's early rise within the company. She admitted she had no proof yet, only suspicion built from fragments and coincidences, but that the moment she'd seen Charles's name attached to Whitmore Holdings while researching her mother's past, she had known she needed to get close enough to find out the truth, whatever it cost her. It explained everything Daniel had wondered about her since the moment she'd claimed a stranger as her father without hesitation. The careful precision, the constant calculation, the way she treated every interaction as a piece of a larger investigation rather than simply a human moment. And yet, watching her now, her guard finally lowered enough to reveal the grief underneath the strategy, Daniel found that his suspicion of her had quietly transformed into something closer to protectiveness, an instinct he hadn't expected and wasn't entirely sure what to do with. He reached across the table, an unplanned gesture, and covered her hand with his own, telling her that whatever she found, however the company's records fell, she wasn't going to face Victor or the truth about her mother alone anymore. Elena looked down at their joined hands with an expression he couldn't quite read, something caught between gratitude and alarm, as though she hadn't accounted in any of her careful planning for the possibility of someone meaning that offer sincerely. She didn't pull away, though, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke. The silence settling between them, not as awkwardness, but as something quieter and more dangerous, an acknowledgement neither was ready to name aloud. That night, after Elena had gone and Mia had fallen asleep, still smelling faintly of blue frosting, Daniel sat on his back porch, turning over everything he'd learned, aware that he had crossed some invisible line from reluctant participant into willing accomplice in whatever Elena was building toward. He thought of Victor, a man he'd never met but had already begun to picture as an adversary, a man convinced of his own righteousness, in a way that made him more dangerous than simple villainy ever could. He thought of Charles, fragile and hopeful, and possibly still in danger from people closer to him than he understood. And he thought of Elena, sitting across his kitchen table with her guard down for the first time, admitting a truth that made her seem less like a stranger who'd upended his life, and more like someone carrying a grief that mirrored his own more closely than he'd expected. He didn't know yet whether the marriage he'd invented to save an old man from security guards would end in reconciliation or ruin. But he understood with growing certainty that there was no version of the coming weeks in which he could simply walk away untouched. The quarterly gathering at Whitmore Holdings took place in a glass-walled event space on the 40th floor of the company's headquarters, and Daniel found himself standing in a rented suit beside Elena, watching 200 shareholders and executives mingle beneath crystal chandeliers that probably cost more than his entire fleet of delivery trucks. He'd spent the drive over trying to remember the fabricated details of their courthouse wedding one more time, running through Mia's school schedule and his sister's maiden name, like a man cramming for an exam whose stakes he still didn't fully understand. And Elena had sat beside him in the back of Charles's car, reviewing a folder of financial documents with the same intensity she'd once used to memorize the details of his life. Charles had insisted on the introduction happening here in front of witnesses because he told Elena privately that a truth announced quietly could be denied later. But a truth announced publicly became something Victor would have to answer to directly. Elena had spent the morning reviewing the financial documents Charles's assistant had finally compiled, and Daniel had watched her expression harden with each page, though she'd refused to tell him exactly what she'd found, saying only that she needed one more piece of confirmation before she said anything aloud. That morning before they'd left for the city, Mia had stood in the kitchen doorway in her pajamas, watching Daniel struggle with an unfamiliar tie, and had asked, with the blunt clarity children specialized in, whether he and Elena were going to a party or a funeral, because his face looked like it belonged to the second one. He'd laughed, despite himself, and told her it was somewhere in between. And Mia had considered this with the seriousness of a much older child, before declaring that grown-up problems always looked like that, somewhere between a party and a funeral, and that she hoped whatever happened, Elena would still come to her school's spring recital next month like she'd promised. The comment had lodged itself somewhere behind Daniel's ribs for the entire drive into the city, a small, unbearable reminder of how thoroughly his daughter had already built a future around a woman whose place in their lives remained by design temporary. Victor Whitmore found them within the first 20 minutes, moving through the crowd with the practiced ease of a man who had spent a decade learning exactly how to occupy a room, his handshake firm and his smile calibrated to a precision that made Daniel's skin prickle with instinctive distrust. He was younger than Daniel had pictured, maybe mid-40s, with the kind of tailored composure that came from genuinely believing every decision he'd ever made had been justified. He greeted Elena with warm, careful words about how delighted the family was to discover a new branch of the Whitmore tree, and Daniel watched Elena match his composure exactly, neither of them betraying the war already quietly underway beneath the pleasantries. Victor mentioned, almost as an aside, that he'd taken the liberty of having the company's legal team prepare some paperwork regarding proper verification of lineage, purely as a formality, he said, smiling in a way that didn't reach his eyes, given the significant interests at stake for the family's legacy. He lingered a moment longer than necessary, his gaze sliding briefly to Daniel with an appraisal that felt less like curiosity and more like a man cataloging a potential obstacle before excusing himself to greet a cluster of board members near the bar. Daniel exhaled slowly once Victor had moved out of earshot, and Elena murmured beside him that Victor's easy charm was exactly the mask she'd expected, practiced over years of convincing an entire board that his ambition and the company's interests were one and the same. She reminded Daniel in a low voice meant only for him that whatever happened in the next hour, he needed to trust that she knew what she was doing, even if it looked reckless from where he stood. And Daniel found himself nodding, despite the unease coiling tighter in his chest with every passing minute. He scanned the crowd, noting the easy confidence of people who had spent their lives inside rooms like this one, the practiced laughter and the watchful eyes tracking every handshake for hidden meaning, and felt, not for the first time since the lobby, entirely out of his depth in a world he'd only stumbled into by accident. A waiter passed with a tray of champagne, and Daniel declined out of some instinct that told him he needed his head entirely clear for whatever was coming. Though Elena took a glass and didn't drink from it, simply held it as a prop. Another small piece of armor in a room built entirely from performance. Charles arrived a few minutes later, steadier on his feet than Daniel had seen him since the collapse, dressed in a dark suit that seemed to restore some of the authority age and grief had worn away from him. The room's attention shifted visibly toward him the moment he stepped onto the small raised platform near the center of the space, conversations quieting in ripples as people turned to face their host. He tapped a glass for quiet, and when the murmur of 200 conversations died down, he spoke without notes, his voice carrying farther than Daniel expected from a man who'd been on the verge of collapse in a lobby only weeks earlier. He told the room that he had recently discovered a granddaughter he hadn't known existed, the daughter of his late daughter Anna, and that he intended, effective immediately, to formally recognize her as family, both personally and within the structure of Whitmore Holdings. A murmur of surprise moved through the crowd, some faces lighting with genuine warmth, others narrowing with the calculating curiosity of people already recalculating the balance of power in the room. He gestured for Elena to join him, and Daniel watched her walk up with a composure that looked to everyone else in the room like quiet dignity, though he alone seemed to notice the tension coiled in her shoulders as she crossed the platform. It was Charles's next sentence that changed the temperature of the entire room. He said that, in reviewing the company's records over the past several weeks, in preparation for formally welcoming Elena into the family, he had discovered irregularities in financial transfers dating back nearly 2 decades. Transfers that appeared to trace directly to the disappearance of his daughter Anna's trust fund. A fund that had been quietly emptied under signatures that, upon closer inspection, did not match Anna's own handwriting. A ripple moved through the crowd, phones lowering slightly as attention sharpened, and Daniel saw Victor's carefully maintained smile falter for the first time. A flicker of something sharp and cornered passing behind his eyes before the mask reassembled itself. Charles continued, his voice steady despite the visible effort it cost him, saying that the signatures instead matched documents authorized by a young executive assistant working in the finance department at the time. An assistant who had coincidentally been promoted rapidly in the years following Anna's disappearance, eventually rising to become the very nephew now running daily operations of the company. Victor's composure cracked audibly this time, his voice rising above the murmuring crowd as he accused Charles of being manipulated by a stranger who had appeared out of nowhere with a convenient story and an even more convenient set of forged conclusions designed specifically to seize a fortune she had no legitimate right to. He turned to Elena directly, his voice dropping into something colder and more personal, and asked her, in front of the entire room, how much she had actually paid for those documents. How much of this elaborate story had been constructed the moment she learned who Charles Whitmore was, and what he was worth. The accusation landed hard enough that Daniel felt his own temper rise sharply, and he stepped forward instinctively, ready to defend her. But Elena's hand found his wrist first, a silent, deliberate signal to let her handle what was coming. Several nearby shareholders had gone still, phones lowering slightly as the confrontation sharpened into something too compelling to look away from, and Daniel became abruptly aware that whatever happened next would happen in front of witnesses who would carry the story out of this room within the hour. She addressed Victor calmly, her voice carrying the same precision she'd used to construct their marriage story weeks earlier, telling him that she understood his anger, understood that a decade of loyalty and sacrifice made this discovery feel like betrayal, but that the documents spoke for themselves, regardless of how anyone felt about them. She revealed then the piece of confirmation she'd been withholding from Daniel all morning, an old employment file she'd obtained showing that the executive assistant who authorized Anna's trust transfers had used a company email account that, according to server records, the company's own IT department had never bothered to purge, belonged unmistakably to a young Victor Whitmore, 23 years old at the time. 3 years before he'd been formally promoted into a position with signing authority. The room went utterly silent, and Daniel watched something break open across Victor's face. The mask finally sliding away to reveal the raw, cornered fury of a man who had spent 2 decades believing his crime had been buried deep enough to never surface. Victor's voice, when it came again, had lost all its polish, roughening into something closer to the truth of the man, underneath the careful decade of reinvention. He told the room, and Charles and Elena, that he had done what he'd done because Anna had never deserved what she'd been given. A company built by 3 generations of Whitmore sweat that she'd been prepared to walk away from for some man Charles hadn't even approved of, some nobody who would have drained the family fortune within a decade if Victor hadn't intervened. He said he'd only meant to redirect a fraction of the trust, enough to prove his own worth to a family that had always treated him, the orphan's nephew taken in out of obligation rather than love, as an afterthought compared to the golden daughter who could do no wrong, even as she threw everything away. His voice cracked on the last words, decades of resentment finally spilling into the open air of a room full of people who had until moments ago considered him the steady, reliable heart of the company. Somewhere near the back, a board member Daniel didn't recognize murmured to a colleague that they'd always found Victor's devotion a little too intense, a little too personal. And Daniel understood that whatever sympathy remained for the man was already curdling into something closer to wary reassessment. Charles's face listening to this confession moved through shock and grief, and something that looked almost like recognition, as though some small, buried part of him had always sensed the resentment simmering beneath Victor's diligence, and had simply chosen for years not to look at it too closely. He said quietly, more to Victor than to the room, that he had failed to see the loneliness eating at a boy he'd raised as his own, that grief over losing Anna had blinded him to the slower, quieter wound growing in his own household, and that no amount of stolen money would have ever filled a place that had needed acknowledgement instead. It wasn't forgiveness exactly, but it carried a weariness that made the confrontation feel less like triumph and more like the sad unearthing of a wound that had been festering unseen for far too long. Victor's shoulders dropped at the words, some last defiance draining out of him, as though he'd spent the confrontation braced for rage and found himself unequipped to withstand grief instead. Daniel watched Elena's expression as Victor spoke and saw something complicated pass across her face. Not triumph exactly, but a kind of exhausted vindication, the particular ache of finally having proof for a wound that had shaped her entire life without her ever fully understanding why. She told Victor quietly enough that only those nearest the platform could hear that she hadn't come here for revenge, that she'd only wanted to understand why her mother had died, believing someone had stolen her life out from under her, and that whatever happened to him now would be decided by the company's board and by the law, not by her. It was a mercy Victor clearly hadn't expected, and it seemed to unsettle him more than open hostility would have, his shoulders sagging as 2 members of the company's legal counsel moved quietly toward him, already speaking in the low, careful tones of people initiating a process that would likely end with criminal charges, rather than a simple resignation. The gathering dissolved into chaos after that, shareholders clustering into anxious knots of conversation, board members pulling Charles aside to discuss emergency measures. And in the middle of it all, Daniel found himself standing alone with Elena near the floor-to-ceiling windows, both of them watching the wreckage of Victor's exit as security escorted him from the building with far more gentleness than the 2 guards had shown Charles in that lobby weeks earlier. Elena's hands were shaking now that the performance was over, the adrenaline that had carried her through the confrontation draining away to leave something rawer and more frightened underneath. And Daniel reached for her without thinking. The gesture entirely unplanned and utterly unlike the careful choreography they'd rehearsed for every previous encounter with Charles's world. It was in that unguarded moment, with her hands trembling in his and the city spread out gold and glittering below the windows, that Daniel finally asked the question he'd been avoiding for weeks, ever since the diner conversation that had first cracked her composure. He asked her directly what happened now that she had what she'd come for, now that Charles was confirmed as her grandfather, and Victor was exposed, and the trust fund mystery was solved. He asked whether their marriage, however invented its origin, still served any purpose to her, or whether he and Mia had simply been useful props in a story that had now reached its natural end. The question landed harder than he intended, and he watched Elena flinch, not from anger, but from something that looked uncomfortably close to guilt. And in the silence that followed, he understood that he had accidentally uncovered a truth she hadn't yet been ready to face herself. She admitted haltingly that she had planned from the very beginning to end the arrangement quietly, once the inheritance situation resolved itself, to release him from the fiction with the promised financial support and disappear back into the private consulting work that had brought her here in the first place, believing it was the cleanest way to spare him and Mia from any deeper entanglement with a family this complicated and dangerous. But somewhere in the weeks since that first lie in the lobby, she confessed the plan had stopped feeling clean at all, had instead started feeling like something she dreaded rather than anticipated. And she didn't know what to do with the feeling that contradicted every careful calculation she'd built her adult life around. Daniel felt something in his chest tighten at her admission, recognizing in her hesitation the same fear he'd carried since his divorce. The terror of trusting a version of happiness that had arrived through such an improbable, fragile door. Before he could respond, Charles appeared at their side, his face still pale from the confrontation, but steadier than Daniel expected. And he told them both with the directness of a man who had just watched 2 decades of buried grief resolve itself in a single evening, that he intended to formally name Elena as his heir within the week, regardless of whatever legal proceedings followed with Victor. He added with a small, knowing smile that suggested he'd noticed far more of the tension between Daniel and Elena than either of them realized, that he hoped whatever arrangement existed between his granddaughter and her husband was built on more than the convenient timing that had first brought them together, because he had grown fond enough of Daniel and of Mia that losing them from his life now would feel like a second loss, layered atop decades of grief he'd only just begun to heal from. The comment landed with unexpected weight, and Daniel watched Elena's face color slightly, caught between honesty and the habit of deflection that had protected her for so long. Later that night, after Charles's driver had dropped them both back at Daniel's house, and Mia's babysitter had gone home, reporting an uneventful evening of cartoons and an early bedtime, Daniel and Elena sat on the porch steps in a silence that felt entirely different from every silence they'd shared before, heavier with things neither had said aloud, yet lighter somehow for the truths finally spoken inside that glass-walled room. Elena told him quietly that she needed to think, that everything about the last several weeks had unfolded so far outside anything she'd planned for, that she no longer trusted her own instincts about what came next. And Daniel, understanding the particular vertigo of having your careful plans dissolve into something unexpectedly real, told her he understood that he wasn't asking her for an answer tonight, only for honesty about whether an answer might exist at all. Somewhere down the road, they'd accidentally started walking together. She left before midnight, and Daniel stood in his driveway watching her taillights disappear the same way he had weeks earlier outside Charles's house. Except this time the ache in his chest felt different, sharper and more specific. No longer the vague unease of an uncertain stranger, but the particular grief of watching someone he had started against every reasonable instinct to genuinely care for walk away, uncertain of her own feelings. He climbed the stairs to check on Mia before bed, and found her asleep with the stuffed rabbit tucked under one arm, and curled against her other side the small toy Charles had given her weeks earlier. And he stood in the doorway for a long moment, thinking about how thoroughly two strangers had rearranged his entire understanding of what his small, careful life could hold, and wondering whether the coming days would bring him something worth the risk, or simply the quiet, familiar ache of having let himself hope for more than a fabricated marriage was ever meant to give him. 3 weeks passed after the confrontation at Whitmore Holdings, and in that time, Daniel watched the fragile, undefined thing between himself and Elena stretch thin under the weight of her silence. She called less often than before, always with some legitimate reason tied to Charles's recovery or the legal proceedings mounting against Victor, and each conversation carried the careful, measured distance of a woman, deliberately keeping one foot outside a door she hadn't decided whether to walk through. Daniel didn't push. He'd learned enough about her by now to know that pressure only drove her further behind the walls she'd spent a lifetime building. So instead, he waited, filling the empty hours with work at the shop and evenings with Mia, who asked about Elena with a persistence that made the ache in his chest sharper every time he had to offer some vague, hopeful answer he didn't entirely believe himself. The business itself had steadied during those weeks in a way that still felt faintly unreal to him. The capital Elena had arranged before any of this had spiraled into inheritance disputes and courtroom depositions had come through exactly as promised. No strings attached beyond what she'd originally offered, and Daniel found himself in the strange position of watching his father's old company right itself financially, while his personal life remained the one variable he couldn't seem to steady, no matter how carefully he managed it. He caught himself more than once standing in the empty warehouse after his crew had gone home, turning the business card she'd first handed him in the parking garage over in his fingers, the blue ink long since smudged from handling, wondering whether the distance she'd created was mercy or retreat, and whether he had any right to hope for the former. During those same weeks, Elena spent more evenings than she admitted to anyone sitting across from Charles in his study, going through boxes of Anna's old belongings that Charles had kept sealed in a storage room for over 2 decades, unable to open them alone, but unwilling to discard them either. It was there, surrounded by faded photographs and a handwriting she was only now learning to recognize as her mother's youthful script, that Charles told her stories about Anna he'd never spoken aloud to anyone. How she'd hated the formality of the family's social obligations. How she used to sneak down to the kitchen at midnight to bake with the household staff, simply because she preferred their company to the guests upstairs. How she'd fallen in love with a man Charles had initially disapproved of, not because he lacked ambition, but because Charles himself had been too consumed by the company to notice his daughter needed something softer than legacy and expectation. Elena found herself crying more in those quiet evenings than she had in the 6 years since her mother's funeral. Grief finally given room to exist without the armor of investigation wrapped around it, and Charles, watching her, admitted one evening that he thought, perhaps, he had needed this reckoning as much as she had. 2 people finally allowed to grieve the same woman together, instead of alone. It was Mia, in the end, who forced the issue between Daniel and Elena, though she had no idea she was doing it. Her spring recital arrived on a Thursday evening in early May, a modest affair in the elementary school gymnasium with folding chairs and a slightly out-of-tune piano, and Daniel had resigned himself to attending alone, telling himself it was foolish to expect Elena to remember a promise made in passing during a season that had upended her entire life. He arrived early to save seats out of habit more than hope, and was adjusting his tie in the reflection of a trophy case when he heard Mia's delighted shriek echo down the hallway, a sound he recognized instantly and turned toward before his mind had even processed what it meant. Elena was crouched at Mia's height near the gymnasium doors, still in the tailored coat she must have worn straight from some meeting, holding a small bouquet of flowers, clearly bought in haste from a gas station somewhere along the way. And the sight of her there, keeping a promise no one would have blamed her for forgetting, undid something in Daniel's chest that he'd been carefully holding together for 3 weeks. She caught his eye over Mia's shoulder and offered a small, uncertain smile, the kind that asked permission rather than assumed welcome. And Daniel crossed the gymnasium floor without deciding to stopping close enough that he could see the exhaustion beneath her careful makeup, the particular tiredness of someone who had spent the last several weeks fighting battles on multiple fronts at once. She told him quietly before he could ask that she'd needed the time to sort through things that had nothing to do with him. Legal depositions regarding Victor, board meetings about her formal position within the company, decisions about whether to sell her mother's old apartment or keep it. Grief that had finally caught up to her, now that the investigation was resolved and there was nothing left to distract her from simply missing a mother she'd spent months chasing answers about, instead of allowing herself to mourn. She admitted, in a voice pitched low enough that it belonged only to him, that grief without a mystery to solve felt almost unbearable in its stillness, that she'd spent so long treating her mother's death as a puzzle to be cracked, that she hadn't known what to do with herself once the puzzle was finally solved and only sorrow remained. Daniel didn't interrupt, understanding instinctively that she needed to say this before anything else could be said between them. And when she finished, she added, almost as an afterthought, that she hadn't forgotten the single promise she'd made to his daughter, even during the weeks she'd needed distance from him. The recital itself passed in a blur of small children stumbling through simplified piano pieces and recorder solos that tested the patience of even the most devoted parents. But Daniel found himself watching Elena more than the stage, noting the way she leaned forward when Mia's turn finally came, her face lit with a genuine, unguarded pride that had nothing calculated about it at all. Mia played her piece imperfectly, missing a note near the end that made her wince visibly before recovering, and the applause that followed felt to Daniel like the first entirely uncomplicated moment he'd experienced in months. Afterward, in the crowded gymnasium lobby, thick with proud parents and excited children clutching juice boxes, Mia ran directly to Elena rather than to Daniel, throwing her arms around her waist and declaring with the blunt honesty children specialized in that she'd been scared Elena wouldn't come, because grown-ups sometimes said things they didn't mean, but that she'd hoped anyway, because Elena didn't seem like that kind of grown-up. Daniel watched Elena's composure crack slightly at the words, her hand coming up to smooth Mia's hair, with a tenderness that looked entirely unrehearsed, and understood that whatever war Elena had been fighting internally these past weeks, some part of it had just been decided by a 7-year-old's unguarded faith. They drove back to Daniel's house separately, but Elena followed anyway, staying for the pizza Daniel had promised Mia as a celebration, and long after Mia had gone to bed, exhausted and triumphant, the two of them found themselves back on the porch steps, where so many of their unfinished conversations had taken place before. The night was warm enough that neither of them reached for a jacket, and for a while they simply sat in silence, the kind that had grown comfortable between them, despite everything unresolved. Until Elena finally spoke, telling him that she'd made a decision during the weeks she'd stayed away, though it wasn't the decision she'd originally set out to make. She told him that she had planned, when this all began, to release him from their arrangement the moment the inheritance and the investigation were settled, to compensate him generously for his trouble, and disappear back into a life reorganized around new wealth and a newly discovered family, believing that was the responsible, clean way to end something that had begun as nothing more than a convenient lie. But she confessed, her voice growing quieter, more uncertain than Daniel had ever heard it, that every time she'd tried to picture that clean ending over the past 3 weeks, all she could see was Mia's face at the door of the school gymnasium and Daniel's expression the day he'd asked her, with more vulnerability than she'd expected from a man who had every reason to be furious with her, whether their marriage still served any purpose beyond convenience. She told him she'd realized, somewhere in the sleepless nights spent staring at legal documents and grief-worn photographs of her mother, that the version of her life she actually wanted wasn't the one she'd been chasing since Anna's death, the one built entirely around uncovering a betrayal and reclaiming a stolen inheritance, but the messier, unplanned one that had somehow assembled itself around a stranger's kitchen table and a little girl's blue frosted cupcakes. She added, almost embarrassed by the admission, that she'd found herself one evening sitting alone in her mother's empty apartment, surrounded by unpacked boxes, and had caught herself wondering not what Anna would think of the resolved inheritance dispute, but what she would think of Daniel, of Mia, of the accidental family Elena had found without ever intending to look for one. Daniel felt something loosen in his chest at her words, a tightness he hadn't fully acknowledged carrying since the confrontation at Whitmore Holdings. And he asked her carefully exactly what she was saying, needing to hear it stated plainly rather than trust his own hopeful interpretation of her careful phrasing. She told him then, without the hedging and calculation that had defined nearly every conversation between them until now, that she wanted to stay, not because Charles had asked her to make their marriage real, not because it was convenient or strategically wise, but because somewhere in the accidental chaos of the past 2 months, she had fallen in love with him, and with his daughter, in a way she hadn't planned for, and couldn't have engineered if she'd tried. She admitted it frightened her more than facing Victor across a room full of shareholders ever had, because financial fraud and corporate betrayal were problems she knew how to dismantle, piece by piece, while love, real and unguarded and entirely outside her control, was a variable she'd spent her whole adult life avoiding, precisely because her mother's life had been shattered by trusting the wrong version of it. Daniel reached for her hand, then the gesture no longer tentative the way it had been in the glass-walled event space weeks earlier, and told her that he understood exactly what she meant, that he'd spent the years since his divorce building a careful, contained life specifically to avoid ever again handing his heart to someone capable of walking away from it, and that somewhere during this improbable, chaotic mess of a lie turned reality, she had become the one person he genuinely wanted to risk that fear for again. He told her, too, about the business card still worn soft at the edges in his wallet, admitting he'd carried it through every one of the weeks she'd stayed distant, not because he needed the number, which he'd long since memorized, but because throwing it away had felt irrationally like giving up on something he wasn't ready to release. Elena laughed softly at that, a sound thick with unshed tears, and told him that she'd kept the diner receipt from their very first strategy session, tucked into the same folder as her mother's letters, for reasons she'd never quite examined until just now. The following week brought its own complications, as Charles insisted on formalizing Elena's position within Whitmore Holdings, with a ceremony far more modest than the quarterly gathering had been, but still significant enough to draw attention from the business press that had been following Victor's unraveling scandal with predatory interest. Daniel stood beside Elena as Charles officially named her vice chair of the company's board, a title that came with responsibilities neither of them had fully anticipated when this had all begun with a collapsed old man in a marble lobby. Charles, visibly stronger than he'd been in months, pulled Daniel aside during the small reception that followed and told him with the directness of a man who had already lost too much time to grief and secrecy that he intended to formally welcome Daniel into the family as well, regardless of whether the marriage between him and Elena had begun as fiction, because he'd watched enough real families disguise themselves as functional ones over the decades to recognize genuine devotion when he finally saw it in front of him. Victor's case moved through the legal system with the particular slowness of white-collar litigation. And though Daniel had expected some lingering satisfaction from watching the man who had accused Elena of fabricating her identity face the consequences of his own decades-old deception, he found instead that the resolution carried more sorrow than triumph. Victor pleaded guilty to fraud rather than face a lengthy trial, accepting a sentence that would keep him out of the company and largely out of public life for years. And Charles, despite everything, quietly arranged for a portion of Victor's eventual restitution to be directed toward a modest trust for Victor's own estranged son, a boy from a brief early marriage that Victor had rarely mentioned to anyone. Elena told Daniel the evening she learned of Charles's decision that she found herself unable to fully hate a man whose crime had grown from the same wound of feeling unseen and unloved that had shaped so much of her own life, and that some part of healing from all of this meant refusing to let Victor's bitterness become the last word on what family could mean. Summer arrived gradually, bringing with it a version of normalcy Daniel hadn't dared to imagine possible back when he'd first blurted out a desperate lie to protect a stranger from security guards. Elena moved into the house with him and Mia, not with the fanfare of a formal wedding announcement, but with the quiet, incremental accumulation of small things: a toothbrush left in the bathroom, a second set of keys, boxes of books slowly filling the shelves Daniel had built years earlier and never quite finished furnishing. Mia treated the transition as though it had always been inevitable, informing her school friends with total confidence that her family had simply grown by one person, the way families sometimes did. And Daniel found himself grateful again and again for his daughter's uncomplicated capacity to accept love wherever it genuinely appeared, without demanding it follow any particular script. Some evenings, watching Elena help Mia with homework at the same kitchen table where a locket had first been opened to reveal 2 faded photographs, Daniel found it almost impossible to remember the version of his life that had existed before that collapse in Sterling Plaza's lobby, as though the man he'd been then belonged to some other, smaller story. It was on a warm evening in late June, nearly 4 months after the collapse in Sterling Plaza's lobby, that Daniel finally asked Elena the question he'd been quietly building toward since the night on the port steps when she told him she wanted to stay. He planned something elaborate initially, influenced by the elegant world Elena now moved through as vice chair of a major company, but had ultimately abandoned every complicated idea in favor of something simpler, more honest to how they'd actually built this relationship in the first place. He proposed in his own backyard, with Mia as the only witness, holding a ring far more modest than anything Elena's new social circle might have expected, and told her that he wanted to make real the marriage they'd first invented under fluorescent lights in a parking garage. Not because a lie required correcting, but because somewhere between that lie and this ordinary summer evening, they had built something neither of them had planned for, and both of them now genuinely wanted to keep. Elena said yes before he'd finished the sentence, her composure so carefully guarded through months of investigation and confrontation and grief, finally giving way entirely to something unguarded and joyful. And Mia's delighted shriek echoed across the yard, loud enough that a neighbor's dog began barking somewhere down the block. Charles, when they told him the following day, wept openly at the news, admitting that he had hoped for exactly this outcome from the moment he'd noticed the way Daniel looked at Elena across his dinner table months earlier, though he'd been careful never to say so aloud, for fear of pressuring 2 people already navigating an impossibly complicated situation. He insisted on hosting the wedding himself, a smaller affair than the corporate world might have expected from a Whitmore family celebration, held in the garden of his own house, where the whole complicated story had first truly begun to unravel, over roasted chicken and a locket containing 2 faded photographs. In the weeks leading up to the wedding, Charles took it upon himself to handle one detail he insisted on managing personally. Contacting an old jeweler who had once repaired Anna's locket decades earlier and was remarkably still working out of the same small shop downtown. He commissioned a second, smaller locket as a wedding gift for Elena, this one containing a new photograph, Daniel and Mia standing together at the spring recital, tucked beside a tiny fragment of Anna's original photograph that Charles had carefully copied and trimmed to fit. He presented it to Elena the night before the wedding, his hands steady this time, and told her that he wanted her to carry forward not just the grief of what had been lost, but proof that new joy could sit comfortably beside old sorrow without either one erasing the other. Elena wore both lockets to the ceremony, one old and tarnished, one new and bright, and told Daniel later that the weight of them together against her chest felt less like a burden and more like balance. The night before the wedding, Daniel's sister Rosa arrived from out of state with a suitcase full of decorations she insisted on hanging herself, and spent the evening in Daniel's kitchen going through old photo albums with Mia spread across the floor between them, pulling out pictures of Daniel as a boy to show his daughter what her father had looked like at her age. Mia, appointed flower girl for the ceremony, spent an anxious hour practicing her walk down an imaginary aisle marked out with masking tape across the living room floor, scattering imaginary petals from an empty basket, while Rosa called out gentle corrections about pace and posture between fits of laughter. At one point, Mia stopped mid-walk and asked her aunt with the same searching seriousness she brought to most important questions, whether it was normal to love someone as much as she loved Elena, when that someone hadn't been part of her family for very long at all. And Rosa, setting the basket down, told her that love had never once cared about calendars, that some people simply arrived in your life already belonging there, and that Mia's instincts about people had clearly been good ones from the very beginning. Daniel, listening from the hallway with a stack of folded napkins in his arms, felt his throat tighten at his daughter's easy wisdom, thinking that perhaps children understood the architecture of love more honestly than adults ever managed to, uncomplicated by the fear of being wrong. On the morning of the wedding, Daniel stood in front of the mirror, adjusting the same kind of tie he'd struggled with months earlier before the quarterly gathering, and found Mia watching him from the doorway exactly as she had that morning, though her expression now held none of the worried uncertainty from before. She told him, with the same blunt clarity she'd offered him then, that this time his face looked like it belonged entirely to the party, and not even a little bit to the funeral. And Daniel laughed, pulling her into a hug, thinking of how thoroughly this improbable chain of events, born from a single desperate lie in a crowded lobby, had rearranged the entire shape of what he understood a family could be. Elena, when she appeared at the end of Charles's garden path an hour later, wore no elaborate gown, only a simple dress, the color of the locket she still wore faithfully around her neck, the same locket that had first betrayed her identity to a trembling old man, and had since become, for all of them, a symbol not of the secrets they'd hidden, but of the truths they'd eventually found the courage to reveal. Charles walked her down the short garden aisle himself, his steps steady, his eyes wet, but his smile unwavering. And when he handed her hand to Daniel, he leaned in close enough that only the two of them could hear, and told Daniel quietly that he was entrusting him with the second chance at family that fate had somehow improbably decided to give an old man too stubborn to stop hoping. The ceremony itself was brief and unpretentious. Vows exchanged beneath a trellis Charles's gardener had spent the week covering in white roses, Mia standing proudly beside them, holding a small basket of petals she scattered with far more enthusiasm than precision. And when Daniel finally kissed his bride in front of the small gathering of people who had somehow, against every reasonable expectation, become his family, he felt none of the fear that had haunted him since his divorce, only a quiet, settled certainty that the lie he'd told to protect a falling stranger had in the end delivered him to exactly the life he hadn't known he was still allowed to want. At the small reception that followed, Rosa stood to offer a toast with a glass of lemonade rather than champagne, joking that someone needed to stay sober enough to keep an eye on the flower girl, and told the gathered guests that she'd watched her brother close himself off from the possibility of love for years after his divorce, guarding himself and his daughter so carefully that she'd worried he might never let anyone close again. She said that whatever unlikely circumstances had brought Elena into their lives, whether by accident or fate or a stranger's collapse in a marble lobby, she had never seen her brother look as unguarded and as certain as he had these past months, and that watching Mia flourish under the steady presence of a woman who had chosen to stay rather than simply pass through was a gift she hadn't known to hope for on her family's behalf. Charles followed with his own toast, his voice thick with emotion, thanking Daniel for a kindness extended to a frightened, disoriented old man who had needed a stranger's protection far more than he'd needed a company's profits, and telling the room that sometimes the truest families were the ones built not from blood alone, but from the choices people made to stand beside each other when it would have been easier to walk away. Later that evening, as the small reception wound down, and Mia finally succumbed to exhaustion in a chair near the garden's edge, clutching a half-eaten piece of wedding cake, Daniel found Elena standing alone near the same spot where Charles had first opened her locket months earlier, and he came to stand beside her, following her gaze toward the darkening sky beginning to fill with early summer stars. She told him quietly that she kept waiting for the old instinct to return, the one that had driven her for years to treat every relationship as a calculation, every kindness as a transaction with hidden terms, and that its absence still surprised her more than she'd expected. This new, unguarded feeling of simply trusting the life in front of her without needing to investigate its foundations first. Daniel wrapped an arm around her, telling her that trust, real trust, was less a single decision than 1,000 small ones made every day, and that he intended to keep choosing her, deliberately and without hesitation, for as long as she'd let him. They stood together in Charles's garden as the stars grew brighter overhead. Two people who had begun as strangers, bound by a single reckless lie, and had become, through months of danger and grief and unexpected tenderness, something neither of them could have planned for, but both now recognized as home. The two lockets at Elena's throat caught the last light of the evening, one holding the faded photographs of a love story that had ended in tragedy decades earlier, the other holding proof of a new one just beginning. And Daniel found himself grateful in a way he hadn't expected to feel about any of this, that Anna's old grief had somehow, through all its painful unraveling, cleared the path toward a new story, capable of finally ending well. Charles's laughter carried across the garden as he entertained a small cluster of guests with some story from decades past, and Mia stirred sleepily in her chair, and somewhere beyond the trellis of white roses, an entire family that had assembled itself from a single desperate lie settled into the quiet, ordinary happiness of a life finally fully theirs.